Hello everyone and welcome to another special episode of 4 Films. I'm your host Zack Bishop. Today I'm pitting two franchises against each other in an unscripted cage match to the death. Just the way I like it. Not really, that has no relevance to anything. Based off the amazing Capcom video game, Resident Evil was the first adaptation of a film of the game of the same name. Now, adaptation can be seen as a loose interpretation in this particular case. Of course, some of the basics were still there, such as shooting zombies, an Umbrella secret laboratory, and cheesy dialogue. The cheese is delicious. So of course the first film was loosely based on the first game, and the second film is loosely based on the second and third games in the series. Of course, one of the major differences being that the character of Alice, much like an earlier draft of the film, was supposed to be similar to Alice from Alice in Wonderland, including the reference to the Red Queen, which strangely enough does fit with the strange world of Resident Evil. However, the results were not as glorious. As for the Underworld films, they're based off the tabletop games Vampire the Masquerade, Werewolf the Apocalypse, and so on and so forth, from White Wolf Publishing. But unlike the Resident Evil films, the Underworld films were met with a lawsuit, I believe, because they were not cleared to use any of the names and stories from those games. However, the results of the films were better than they expected. So Underworld establishes the lore, the characters, something happens. Resident Evil establishes the characters, the lore, and something happens. When you look at these films separately, Resident Evil does stand up on its own, but it's just bare minimum. Really. It has a lot of 2000s cheese, which is different from 90s cheese. 90s cheese is much more endearing, whereas 2000s cheese is much more cringeworthy. But when you look at Underworld, you see a long-lasting goth aesthetic, which is still relevant to this day. And much like both films and their subject matter, the fluctuation of popularity over time. The zombie craze was just getting in full swing, so that worked in Resident Evil's favors, where vampires and werewolves were kind of on the way out, which worked against Underworld, yet someone like me, who loves that kind of stuff, Underworld was amazing. And while Resident Evil was arguably much more popular, that adaptation as opposed to Underworld is nowhere near as interesting, visually or story-wise. A lot of the elements that made Resident Evil are actually taken out of that first film, whereas Underworld kind of takes you into the medieval folklore setting of a vampire werewolf film and brings you into the future, or present day at the time. As far as production values go, I have to say that Underworld looks much better than Resident Evil. The last time I viewed Resident Evil, I really had to reevaluate my entire stance on the film itself. I still don't hate it as much as I absolutely despise the other films that came after it, but it's just so...
They sucked his brains out.
much of nothing. It makes you feel like you're going to go into a Resident Evil game, but it ends up just being very hollow. And the most interesting aspect is actually, much like a Roger Ebert review, the amnesia plot towards the beginning, before the zombies even happen. Like, that's almost more intriguing than the whole rest of the film. And then you look at Underworld, and it had the benefit of being separated by time away from the original tabletop games, so it almost felt like it was a fresh concept on its own. Because even though people had heard of vampires versus werewolves before that, and I'm sure it's happened in other films and TV shows, this was the first time that a mainstream release was released at a time where it was the farthest away from any source material. Now, I have looked up the review scores on both sets of films in these franchises, and I'm very shocked that the Resident Evil series was held a little bit higher than the Underworld series. Now, both did not do very well at all. But I think, again, it comes down to people know what Resident Evil is more than Underworld because they have no point of reference because that's even further back. But it's also unfortunate because they kept making Resident Evil movies. So let's look at the next set of films, Underworld Evolution and Resident Evil Apocalypse. So when Resident Evil Apocalypse came out, I was actually kind of excited. I thought, wow, they're really gonna course correct the little mistakes that they made in the first one and really get to the Resident Evil story and hopefully have all the characters. And no, they did not. As you might have seen in one of my other reviews talking about the 4 franchises that I hate, Yeah, this was the beginning of my hatred of the Resident Evil films, because they are just unexcusably bad. They forget their own continuity between films, and it just became more and more of a joke, where I can't believe that they're making it and people keep going to see these films. Now with Underworld Evolution, it is kind of just rehashing the first film, but that's because it's more of a continuation, like a direct continuation. Much like Resident Evil Apocalypse is to Resident Evil, and yet it doesn't flow like one. It is its own separate thing. But if you watch Underworld Evolution on its own, it works, but it works best if you had just watched the first Underworld. So that's both a strength and a weakness at the same time. It flows as an actual ending to the first Underworld, so watching them as a double feature would make more sense. Whereas you watch Resident Evil and Resident Evil Apocalypse, you do get a sense of it's two separate films, but they're both bad. Whereas Underworld Evolution isn't as good as the first one, but at least it kind of bookends it. So you can already see where just that little bit of care put into the way that the stories are told makes a big difference. Plus, Underworld Evolution doesn't have Mike Epps with 2 golden guns. My shit's custom. I just... Oh boy. If you look at Underworld both separate and compared against Resident Evil, Underworld takes the victory in both films. Because somehow each film got worse on both sides, and yet Underworld still made it make sense, whereas Resident Evil just said good enough with less effort than Underworld's good enough. It's not Shakespearean. It's not something that you're going to hold in high regards as some kind of next level art form. But when you look at them as separate films and then put them together as a franchise, Underworld has a clear vision of what they want to do, and they execute those visions. Whereas Resident Evil is seemingly banking on the popularity of Resident Evil. It is very clear that they did not care about the story enough to make it the story from the games. There was no adaptation in that. Even with the newest film that came out, Resident Evil Welcome to Raccoon City, which is a different continuity, despite that being a complete mess from what I hear, it still seems that they at least tried to incorporate more of the game into the film, despite those results being less than satisfactory. So in conclusion, the winner of this battle is the Underworld franchise. There's no reason for Resident Evil to have any kind of higher score than Underworld, other than, again, the fact of the time and popularity of Resident Evil as a pop culture reference, whereas Vampire the Masquerade, even Kindred the Embrace, the TV show, were years before Underworld even existed. So that's my vote on the subject. What are your thoughts? Which film franchise do you think is better? Which movies do you think are better? Tell me in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and you can support these videos and my music at Patreon/TheBisness. Thanks again for watching. I'll see you next time.